How could a man fast for 40 days in the desert and walk out? Not collapsed, not crawling, but walking. That question has remained without a satisfactory answer for 2,000 years. And the reason is that very few have taken the time to understand what fasting truly was in the world of Jesus. It was not an optional spiritual practice. It was not a modern diet, nor a religious trend. It was an ancestral technology of transformation that first-century Jews mastered from childhood with precise rules, established schedules, and physical and social consequences perfectly understood. When we understand that, the 40 days of Jesus in the desert stop being an impossible mystery and become something far more powerful. A conscious and radical choice that shook the foundations of the religious world of his time. To understand fasting in the time of Jesus, one must first understand the body that fasted in first-century Palestine. The human body was already adapted to scarcity, not by accident, but through generations of life in an arid environment where food was never guaranteed. Ordinary Jewish families ate twice a day, and not always with abundance. The first meal came in mid-morning after the first hours of work. The second came at sunset, when the heat eased and work ended. Between one and the other, 8 or 9 hours passed without consuming anything. That rhythm was normal. It was not fasting. It was simply daily life. This means that the body of a first-century Jew was accustomed to prolonged cycles without food in a way that the modern body no longer experiences. That biological adaptation is the first fact that completely changes our understanding of fasting in the Gospels. Formal religious fasting went much further. There were two fundamental categories clearly distinguished in Jewish practice. The first was the complete fast, called in Hebrew tzom, which meant total abstinence from food and drink from dawn until the appearance of the first stars. The second was the partial fast, less documented but equally practiced, where certain foods were eliminated but not all. The prophet Daniel, whose figure was enormously respected in the time of Jesus, describes in the 10th chapter of his book a fast of 3 weeks, during which he ate no pleasant bread, no meat, and no wine. That was a partial fast, not total abstinence, but a selective renunciation as an act of spiritual mourning and search for divine clarity. The Jewish calendar of the first century was sprinkled with mandatory fasts that the entire community had to observe. The most important was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement described in Leviticus chapter 16. It was the only fast explicitly commanded by the Torah, and it lasted from the evening of the 9th day of the 7th month until the evening of the 10th. During that time, no eating, no drinking, no bathing, no wearing leather sandals, and no marital contact occurred. It was an almost total suspension of normal bodily functions as a sign of complete dependence on God. Jesus observed this fast. It was part of his Jewish identity from childhood. His body knew that experience before entering the desert. In addition to Yom Kippur, there were 4 other commemorative fasts established after the Babylonian exile, mentioned in the book of Zechariah chapter 8. They were days that remembered the stages of the destruction of Jerusalem. The fast of the 4th month, the 5th, the 7th, and the 10th. Each had its history, its lament, its reason for being. For the Jewish community of the first century, these days were not arbitrary. They were collective scars turned into ritual, and on that official base, many Jews added voluntary fasts, especially the Pharisees, who fasted twice a week systematically. Luke chapter 18 verse 12 records the prayer of the Pharisee who says with pride, "I fast twice a week." The chosen days were Monday and Thursday, and the choice was not accidental. According to rabbinic tradition, Moses ascended Mount Sinai on a Thursday and descended on a Monday. Fasting on those days was a way to honor that moment of divine revelation. But the Pharisee in Jesus' parable did not fast in silence. he announced it. And that was exactly the practice that Jesus questioned directly and without ambiguity in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 to 18 contain the most specific words that Jesus spoke about fasting, and they are revealing not only for what they prohibit, but for what they assume. Jesus says, "When you fast, but not if you fast." The verb is in a form that implies a regular, expected, established practice. He assumes that his disciples will fast. Then he describes with precision the behavior he criticizes. The hypocrites disfigure their faces so that men may see that they are fasting. The Greek word used for disfigure is aphanizausin, which literally means to make disappear or to hide. But in this context, it describes the act of deliberately neglecting appearance, letting the beard grow unkempt, covering the face with ashes, walking bent over with an expression of suffering. It was religious theater. It had an audience. It had social effect. It had reward in the form of public admiration. The response of Jesus is equally precise in its practical details. He says, "But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face." On those two actions were exactly what a Jew did on normal feast days. Anointing the head with olive oil was the daily gesture of preparing for the day. Washing the face was basic morning hygiene. Jesus instructs his followers to fast in a way that is indistinguishable from a normal day. That the fast not be visible, that it be only between the believer and God alone. That instruction has enormous implications because it goes directly against the social code of the time, where visible fasting was a public demonstration of piety that generated respect and position within the community. To understand how much weight that instruction carried, one must understand the role of fasting in the religious social hierarchy of the first century. The scribes and Pharisees used fasting as a status marker. It was a visible sign of spiritual commitment, of superior discipline, of closeness to God that differentiated the observant from the common. People of the countryside, fishermen like Peter and Andrew, peasants of Galilee, did not have the time or resources to maintain that structure of frequent voluntary fasts. The Pharisees' twice-weekly fast was also, in a way, a class privilege that required not only discipline, but the certainty that there would be food available after the fast, which was not guaranteed for everyone. Jesus came from that rural world. He grew up in Nazareth, a small village in Galilee, where life was hard and practical. His family knew the difference between abstaining from eating by spiritual choice and abstaining by economic necessity. That experience deeply marked his way of speaking about fasting. He never turned it into a sign of superiority. He reframed it as an intimate, invisible act directed exclusively toward the Father. But there is a fast in the Gospels that transcends all known categories and has puzzled theologians, doctors, and historians for centuries. Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 4 describe with almost disconcerting brevity that Jesus, immediately after his baptism in the Jordan, was led by the Spirit into the desert, where he fasted 40 days and 40 nights. At the end of that time, according to the text, he was hungry. That last phrase is medically significant. Intense hunger is not felt during the first days of a prolonged fast. It appears, then decreases around the third or fourth day as the body enters ketosis and begins to metabolize fat. Then it returns with devastating force toward the end of prolonged periods, when reserves are depleted. The text says that Jesus was hungry at the end of the 40 days, which is biologically consistent with an extremely prolonged fast. The number 40 in biblical tradition was not arbitrary. It was a number that resonated in the collective Jewish memory with particular force. Israel had walked 40 years in the desert. Moses had remained 40 days on Mount Sinai without eating or drinking. According to Exodus chapter 24, Elijah had walked 40 days with the strength of a single meal until he reached Horeb. According to the first book of Kings chapter 19, Jesus knew those stories not as abstract references, but as part of his deepest national and religious identity. By entering the desert for 40 days, he was placing his experience within that continuity. He was not repeating a feat. He was fulfilling a pattern. The desert where that fast occurred was the Judean desert, a region that drops east from Jerusalem toward the Dead Sea. It is not a sand desert like the Sahara. It is a desert of rock, gray limestone, steep slopes, deep gorges, and heat that in summer can exceed 40 degrees. At night, the temperature drops dramatically. There is not enough natural shade. There are no visible water sources, except for those who know exactly where to look. It was an environment of extreme deprivation, and Jesus took no provisions. The text is clear. He fasted. He did not eat during that period. What the text does not detail, but what archaeology and anthropology of the first century allow us to reconstruct, is how the body of a young, healthy man adapted from childhood to cycles of scarcity could go through that experience. Modern research on prolonged fasting has confirmed that the human body can survive without food for periods of 30 to 40 days if it maintains adequate hydration. Water was the critical factor. The Judean desert had cisterns carved into the rock since ancient times, some invisible to the untrained eye but known to those who lived in or frequented that region. The community of Qumran, located at the northern end of the Dead Sea, had lived in that environment for generations and knew those resources. Jesus, who according to Luke chapter 4 went into the desert in the Spirit, did not go into the desert without any knowledge of the terrain. Jewish tradition understood fasting as a practice that had effects on the soul, but also on the body in very specific ways. The Talmud, compiled centuries later, but which collects much older traditions, describes in detail the states that one who fasts for a long time goes through. The first state was the acute hunger of the first 2 days, accompanied by weakness and difficulty concentrating. The second state, which arrived around the 3rd or 4th day, was described as a state of unusual clarity, where the mind cleared and spiritual perception sharpened. The rabbis did not describe this as illusion, but as a real effect of fasting on the capacity for spiritual reception. The third state, in very prolonged fasts, was a kind of deep quiet, where the body reduced its demands, and the person could remain in sustained contemplation for hours. It was in that third state that Jesus was tempted. Luke chapter 4 describes the 3 temptations with remarkable narrative economy. The tempter says, "Tell this stone to become bread." The answer of Jesus comes from Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. "Man shall not live by bread alone." Chakri, but there is something more in that passage of Deuteronomy that is rarely quoted in full. The original text says, "He humbled you and let you hunger, and fed you with manna which your fathers did not know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." Shaktikichautikum. The fast in the desert was not only abstinence, it was the conscious recreation of the experience of Israel in the desert, where dependence on God was total and provision came from non-natural sources. The disciples of Jesus also fasted, but with a particularity that generated public tension. Mark chapter 2 verse 18 records a direct confrontation. The disciples of John the Baptist and those of the Pharisees fasted regularly. Someone approached Jesus and asked with an implicit tone of accusation, "Why do the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" It was a question about religious credentials. Fasting was a sign of spiritual seriousness. Those who did not fast were suspected of frivolity, of lack of commitment. The answer of Jesus was a wedding metaphor. Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? Then he added, The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days." Shaktil, that statement is fundamental. Jesus did not abolish fasting. He promised that there would be a time for it, and the early church understood it that way. The book of Acts and the letters of Paul show the first believers fasting at decisive moments. Acts chapter 13, verses 2 and 3 describe how the community in Antioch was fasting and ministering to the Lord when the Holy Spirit set apart Barnabas and Saul for their first mission. It was not a fast of crisis. It was a fast of seeking, of spiritual availability, of openness to divine direction. After receiving that instruction, they fasted again before laying hands on them and sending them off. Fasting framed the most important moments of community life. In Acts chapter 14, verse 23, Paul and Barnabas fast while praying for the elders they are appointing in the new churches. It was an act of humility before the responsibility of that decision. Paul himself describes in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 his experiences of fasting within a list of sufferings for the gospel. He mentions with precision hunger and thirst. The distinction between hunger and fasting is significant. Hunger was involuntary, a consequence of the extreme conditions of itinerant ministry. Fasting was chosen, deliberate, an act of spiritual will within already difficult circumstances. Paul knew the difference in his own body. In the tradition of Jesus, fasting also had a dimension that the Gospels record almost casually, but that was profoundly important: the connection with intercession. In Matthew chapter 17, after the disciples could not cast out a demon from a boy, Jesus casts it out, and they ask him privately, "Why could they not?" The answer of Jesus in the oldest manuscripts is, "Because of your little faith." But in many manuscripts and in later textual tradition, it is added, "But this kind does not come out except by prayer and fasting." Regardless of the textual issue, that tradition reflects the firm belief of the early church that certain levels of spiritual intercession required the accompaniment of fasting, not as magic, but as a radicalization of dependence on God that opened channels of power that would otherwise remain closed. The concrete practice of fasting in first-century Judaism had specific physical rituals that accompanied the abstinence from food. Fasting usually began at sunset of the previous day, following the Hebrew reckoning, where the day begins at evening. This meant that the person fasting prepared from the night before, ending their last meal before sunset, the next day. From dawn, the period of total abstinence began, which extended until the first 3 stars appeared in the night sky. In fasts of affliction, external signs were added. The head was covered with ashes. Sackcloth was worn rough and uncomfortable fabric, which was also the cheapest available. Sandals were removed, especially leather ones, which were items of some value. Walking barefoot was a sign of mourning and humiliation before God. The synagogues, which in the time of Jesus also functioned as community gathering spaces, were the natural place of congregation during community fasts. The service of the fast day included specific readings from the prophets, especially the book of Jonah on Yom Kippur, precisely because it tells the story of an entire people, Nineveh, that fasted in response to the proclamation of the prophet and received mercy from God. That story was the perfect paradigm of what community fasting could achieve: to change the course of events by changing the attitude of the heart. The prophets of the Old Testament had, however, established a fundamental critique of fasting, which Jesus knew perfectly. Isaiah chapter 58 contains one of the most powerful and direct texts on the subject. The prophet describes a people that fast with scrupulous ritual, but at the same time oppress their workers, quarrel and strike. Do not loose the bonds of wickedness. Do not undo the heavy burdens. Do not let the oppressed go free. Do not share bread with the hungry, nor clothe the naked. And God says through the mouth of the prophet, "Is this the fast that I have chosen? The text of Isaiah redefines true fasting not as abstinence from food, but as active liberation of the oppressed. It was justice turned into bodily practice. Jesus knew that text. He preached in the synagogues where it was read regularly. When in Luke chapter 4, in his first public appearance in Nazareth, he opened the scroll of Isaiah and read the passage about the acceptable year of the Lord. He was placing his ministry within that same prophetic stream. The fasting that he practiced and taught was not separable from active compassion, from presence among the poor, from solidarity with the marginalized. It was no coincidence that the only moments when Jesus openly criticizes the Pharisees for their religious practice are moments when that practice is disconnected from concrete mercy. There is a detail about hydration during first-century fasts that changes the practical understanding of everything we have described. The complete fast of Yom Kippur prohibited both food and drink, but individual voluntary fasts, those added by personal initiative, had less uniform rules. Some practitioners maintained total abstinence from water as well. Others allowed small amounts of water, especially in the summer months when Mediterranean heat made dehydration a real danger. The elderly, the sick, and pregnant women were exempted from the strictest fasts, even from Yom Kippur, if their health required it. This flexibility was not weakness, but wisdom built into the system. The goal of fasting was not physical suffering as an end in itself. It was the voluntary renunciation of ordinary satisfaction to create space for something different. That distinction is crucial to understand what Jesus did in the desert. The 40 days were not an act of self-punishment. They were the most radical possible expression of that renunciation, emptying the ordinary space of life completely to fill it with one single thing. The text of Luke says that at the end of the fast, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. The fast did not leave him empty. It filled him with something that changed the course of his ministry. The Didache, a first-century Christian text that reflects practices very close to those of the Jewish community of Jesus, prescribes fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays to distinguish the followers of Christ from the hypocrites who fasted on Mondays and Thursdays. It was a reorientation of the same calendar, not an abolition of the practice. Believers continued to fast, but on different days and according to the instructions of Jesus, with a different attitude. The form changed, the function remained. Fasting in the world of Jesus was also not an exclusively individual practice. There were moments of national crisis where fasting was called as a collective response. The book of Joel describes a call for community fasting in the face of a plague of locusts that had devastated the land. The first book of Kings records that the entire community of Israel fasted in the time of the prophet Elijah. Esther called a 3-day fast for the entire Jewish community before presenting herself to the king. Ezra called a fast at the Ahava River before undertaking the dangerous journey back to Jerusalem. Fasting in those contexts was the collective language of the recognition of human insufficiency in the face of a need that exceeded all available resources. Jesus lived in a time of national crisis. Palestine was under Roman occupation. Taxes were crushing. The tension between religious factions, between zealots, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, was permanent. The messianic hope was red hot. In that context, fasting had a political dimension that could not be ignored. The Pharisees who fasted twice a week were also those who defended the observance of the law as a form of cultural resistance to Roman domination. Fasting was an affirmation of Jewish identity in a world that pressured toward Hellenistic and Roman assimilation. Jesus did not preach a political fast, but neither did he preach a fast disconnected from reality. His teaching on secret fasting was also a critique of the use of fasting as an instrument of social power within the religious community, and that critique had consequences. Those who used visible fasting to build reputation were the same ones who eventually conspired to eliminate him. The coherence of Jesus between what he taught and what he lived was perceived as a threat by those who did exactly the opposite. The Essenes, a community that lived in the Judean desert in the time of Jesus, had their own tradition of fasting, which was even more rigorous than the Pharisaic. Their writings, discovered in Qumran in the 20th century, describe regular periods of fasting, extremely detailed structures of ritual purity, and a community life based on voluntary renunciation. Some researchers have speculated about possible connections between Jesus and that community, especially since John the Baptist, whose figure is intimately connected with the beginning of Jesus' ministry, lived in the desert and practiced an ascetic lifestyle that resonated with some Essene practices. But Jesus, unlike the Essenes and John himself, did not stay in the desert. He left it. He returned to the villages, to the markets, to the houses of those who invited him, including tax collectors and sinners. His fasting was preparation for presence, not a substitute for it. When Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount that the Father who sees in secret will reward the fast done in secret, he was articulating a theology of fasting that was revolutionary in its simplicity. The reward was not public. The audience was not human. The effect was not reputational. It was a transaction between the human soul and God, invisible to the world but real, with a reality that visible rewards could not equal. The teaching transformed fasting from a social instrument into an intimate practice, and in doing so, returned it to its original function. The bodily recognition that human life depends on something more than the food that can be seen, touched, prepared, and consumed. When we understand how fasting was in the time of Jesus, we are not only studying religious history, we are entering the space where the most influential spirituality in human history was formed. A space of silence, of voluntary hunger, of clarity that only arrives when what usually fills time and senses is set aside. The man who came out of the desert after 40 days was not the same as the one who had entered. Fasting had not weakened him. It had prepared him. And what came after the words? The miracles, the compassion, the confrontation with power was born in large part from what happened in that hungry silence under the sun of Judea, where there was no bread, no audience, no visible reward, only the presence of the Father and the decision of a man to live by nothing else.